There are people who scroll, they watch, they see everyone else sharing their lives in real time. Birthdays, sunsets, achievements, struggles, everything. And they just don't. They observe quietly from the sidelines. They consume content without creating it. And if you ask them why, the answer is usually vague. I just don't post, as if it's nothing. But it is a choice, and it's not as simple as being shy or introverted. There's a psychology underneath that silence that most people don't understand. Because here's the thing, people who don't post on social media are actually making a statement. They're just making it by not speaking. Think about what social media really is. It's a demand for visibility. Post or be invisible. Share or don't exist. The algorithm rewards those who perform, those who create, those who put themselves out there constantly. And the people who don't post, they're essentially saying no to that entire game. But the question is why? What are they protecting by staying silent? For some people, it's control. Control over what the world gets to know about them. Control over their narrative. Because once you post something, once it's out there, you've lost control of it. It can be screenshotted, shared, manipulated, misinterpreted. You've made yourself vulnerable. You've given people ammunition. And some people look at that calculation and decide it's not worth it. But for others, it's something different. It's anxiety. It's the paralysis that comes from knowing that whatever you post, someone might judge it, someone might not like it, someone might think less of you because of it. And so they don't post, not because they have nothing to say, but because the risk of being misunderstood, of being rejected, of being seen as less than, feels too high. There's also the perfectionism angle. Some people don't post because whatever they would post wouldn't be perfect enough. The photo isn't right, the caption isn't clever enough, the moment isn't Instagram-worthy, and so they wait, they curate. They never actually post because nothing ever meets their standard. They'd rather say nothing than say something that's not exactly right. And then there are the people who don't post because they're aware. They've seen what social media does. They've seen people become obsessed with likes and comments. They've seen the comparison trap. They've seen friendships destroyed over perceived slights in the form of not being tagged or getting enough engagement, and they want no part of it. They're the ones who see social media for what it is, a carefully constructed performance where everyone's pretending their life is better than it actually is. But here's what's interesting. The reasons people don't post are rarely that simple. It's usually not just one thing, it's a combination. It's a mix of anxiety and control and perfectionism and awareness, all layered on top of each other. And underneath all of that, there's usually something deeper. Many people who don't post grew up in environments where being seen was dangerous, where visibility meant attention you didn't want, where standing out meant getting knocked down. Maybe they had parents who were critical, parents who commented on their appearance, parents who made them feel like they had to be perfect to be acceptable. Or maybe they didn't have critical parents, maybe they just had parents who were checked out, who weren't present, who didn't notice them. And somewhere along the way, the child learned that being visible didn't actually matter, that no one was really paying attention anyway, so why bother putting yourself out there? Some people who don't post grew up experiencing shame, real shame. Maybe they were bullied, maybe they were humiliated in front of their peers, maybe something about them, their appearance, their family, their situation was used against them, and they learned that visibility equals vulnerability equals pain. So they made a decision. They would keep themselves small. They would keep themselves hidden. They would control what people knew about them so they could never be hurt the way they were hurt before. Others grew up in homes where there was instability, where things changed without warning, where they learned to be hypervigilant, to watch what they said, to not draw attention, to blend in, to be invisible. Because invisible people don't get caught in the chaos. Invisible people stay safe. And that lesson, learned so long ago, carries forward into adulthood. They apply it to social media. They apply it to life. They stay quiet. They stay hidden. And some people who don't post are actually narcissistic. They're protecting their image so carefully because their image is everything. They can't post unless it's perfect because imperfection would shatter the constructed version of themselves they've built. They'd rather not post than post something that shows vulnerability or weakness or humanity. They're not hiding, they're just being extremely selective about what they reveal. But most people who don't post aren't narcissistic. Most of them are just scared. Scared of judgment, scared of rejection, scared of being seen for who they actually are as opposed to who they think they should be. And social media, with its public nature, its permanence, its metrics of approval in the form of likes and comments, amplifies that fear. Here's what's fascinating about not posting. It's actually a form of rebellion, but it's a quiet rebellion. It's saying, I don't need external validation to feel okay about myself. I don't need your likes to know that my life has value. I don't need to perform for an audience. And on the surface, that sounds healthy. That sounds evolved. That sounds like wisdom. But sometimes it's not healthy. Sometimes it's avoidance. Sometimes it's using the excuse of social media is fake to avoid the vulnerability that real connection requires. Because here's the thing, social media isn't inherently fake. It's just a tool. And like any tool, it can be used well or used poorly. You can use it to genuinely connect with people. You can use it to document your life authentically. You can use it to put real versions of yourself out there. But if you're not posting, if you're staying completely silent, you might be missing out on something. You might be telling yourself a story about why you're not posting that feels true but isn't actually the whole story. You might be rationalizing a fear as wisdom. You might be calling avoidance integrity. The people who don't post often experience a strange kind of isolation. They're online, but not really. They're participating in the community, but from the shadows. They're observing everyone else's lives while keeping their own hidden. And there's a loneliness in that. There's a distance, because connection requires some level of vulnerability. It requires being seen. And if you're never posting, you're never really being seen by anyone but the people physically in your life. And even then, you might be withholding. You might be keeping parts of yourself hidden because you've learned that it's safer that way. You might be waiting for someone to prove they're trustworthy enough to hear your real thoughts, your real struggles, your real life. And that's a long wait, because most people are too busy with their own stuff to jump through those hoops. What's really interesting is that people who don't post usually have incredibly curated feeds. They follow specific people, they consume content in a specific way. They're extremely intentional about what they're exposed to. And that's not a bad thing, but it also means they're in a bubble. They're seeing a version of reality that's been filtered through their own preferences and fears. They're not being challenged, they're not being exposed to different perspectives. They're not growing in the ways that uncomfortable visibility can force you to grow. The irony is that people who don't post often judge those who do. They look at people posting and think they're shallow, attention-seeking, desperate for validation. And maybe some of them are, but many of them aren't. Many of them are just trying to stay connected, trying to document their lives, trying to feel less alone, trying to be part of a community. And by refusing to post, by staying silent, people who don't post are essentially saying, "I'm better than that. I'm above that. I don't need that." But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that everyone needs connection. Everyone needs to be seen. Everyone needs to matter to someone. And if you're not posting, you might be convincing yourself that you don't need those things. You might be telling yourself that you're fine on your own, that you don't care what people think, that social media is beneath you. But underneath all that, there's usually fear. There's usually pain. There's usually a voice from your past telling you that you're not good enough, that you're not worth showing. The thing about not posting is that it becomes part of your identity. You become the person who doesn't post, and that identity actually prevents you from changing the behavior. Because if you started posting, if you made yourself visible, you'd be betraying that identity. You'd be contradicting the story you've been telling yourself about who you are, and that's terrifying. Because if that story isn't true, then what else isn't true about how you see yourself? If this resonates, if you're recognizing yourself as someone who doesn't post, if you're seeing the fear underneath the choice to stay silent, that's actually important. Because awareness is the first step. You can't change a pattern you don't see. And right now, you might see your non-posting as integrity, as wisdom, as being above the game. But maybe it's worth asking yourself if it's actually serving you. Maybe it's worth asking if you're protecting yourself or limiting yourself. Maybe it's worth asking if the fear of being seen is bigger than the benefit of staying hidden. This doesn't mean you have to start posting. It doesn't mean you have to perform for an audience. It doesn't mean you have to put yourself on social media if it doesn't feel right. But it might be worth examining why you don't. It might be worth looking at the story you're telling yourself about not posting. Because sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are protecting us from pain. And sometimes they're just protecting us from living. Understanding these patterns, looking at why we make the choices we make, that's what we're doing here at The Forgotten Self. We're examining the psychology behind the things we do and don't do, the visible and invisible reasons we show up in the world the way we do. If this helped you see something about yourself, if it cracked something open, subscribe, because we're building a community where these quiet patterns get named, where the fears get acknowledged, where you can begin to understand yourself, the parts you show and the parts you hide. Until next time, consider what you're protecting by staying silent, and ask yourself if it's worth it. This doesn't mean you have to start posting. It doesn't mean you have to perform for an audience. It doesn't mean you have to put yourself on social media if it doesn't feel right. But it might be worth examining why you don't. It might be worth looking at the story you're telling yourself about not posting. Because sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are protecting us from pain. And sometimes they're just protecting us from living. Understanding these patterns, looking at why we make the choices we make, that's what we're doing here at The Forgotten Self. We're examining the psychology behind the things we do and don't do, the visible and invisible reasons we show up in the world the way we do. If this helped you see something about yourself, if it cracked something open, subscribe. Because we're building a community where these quiet patterns get named, where the fears get acknowledged, where you can begin to understand yourself, the parts you show and the parts you hide. Until next time, consider what you're protecting by staying silent, and ask yourself if it's worth it.